Did you know Squid Games is basically a true story that happened in South Korea? Except there were no games, it was all torture and death. And the prize wasn't money, the prize was getting to live. And instead of selling organs, they sold children. And at the end of it, it was all about classism, about how the rich could make more money off of the lives of the poor working class people. I mean, they essentially even wore the same tracksuits. So let's get into it. After the Korean War had ended, Korea was suffering financially, and there were a lot of unhoused people in South Korea. Well, in 1980, after a military general threw a coup d'etat and overthrew the Korean government and became a military dictator, he decided that he didn't want any of these unhoused people, especially because the Olympics were coming to South Korea and Korea was going to be on the world stage. So Chun Doo-won decided that the best solution was to essentially gather up all of these vagrants, as he called them, and essentially hide them away from the public. And the police and some of his goons were tasked to pick up some of these unhoused people, except these detention centers were paid by the government, subsidized by how many people were there. So they didn't just pick up the unhoused people, they started picking off random women off the street, people who were inebriated, as well as many children. Originally it was supposed to be orphan children, but a lot of children who had families who loved them and cared for them were essentially kidnapped by the government and then thrown into these icebox trucks that were oftentimes full to the brim, and then these people were then taken to these detention centers. And the largest of these detention centers was located in the southeastern city of Busan, South Korea. And it was known as 형제복지원, or Brothers' Home. And as you can see, it was massive. Like this man, Han Jong-sun, who in 1984 at the age of 8 years old went on a long-awaited trip into the big city with his sister and his father. But while he was in the city, his father needed to run a couple of errands. So the father had this brilliant idea of dropping his 2 young children off at the police station for a couple of minutes so that he can run a couple of errands. Well, that police officer that the father entrusted to watch his children for like 5 to 10 minutes immediately took his children and put them into one of these ice trucks that went to the brothers' home. Or like this man, Choi Sung-woo, who when he was 13 years old was on his way home from school when a police officer stopped him, searched his bag, and found a half of loaf of bread that his school had given to him for lunch that he didn't finish eating, and asked him where he stole this bread from. And this police officer beat and tortured him. I mean, took a lighter and burned his privates and told him that he wasn't going to let him go until he confessed to the crime, at which point Choi Sung-woo decided that he was just going to lie and say that he did it. Well, just a mere 10 minutes after his false confession, he was led into one of those ice trucks where he was then sent to Brothers' Home, where he served hard time for 5 years. Where on a daily basis, he then witnessed people get beaten so hard that they lose their life, as well as experiencing regular essays from some of the adults during his time there, like many of the other kids. And because these detention centers were the idea of a militant dictator, these detention centers would run like a military operation as well. As you can see, these people were put into these groups, also known as squads, and each squad had a squad leader who not only led the group in regards to moving them around and telling them what to do, but they were also responsible for anyone in their squad misbehaving, which meant that they had to betray the other detainees in order to survive themselves. And these people in these detention camps were used as indentured servants for free labor. In fact, the detainees actually built all of the buildings hand by hand, and in the beginning, before they had all the buildings, they were just living under these awnings essentially. They were dying daily. And it wasn't just the adults that were helping to build all of these buildings, it was the children as well as jobs that made products that then made the owners of the detention centers money. And that wasn't the only way the owners of these detention centers were making their monies off the backs of these wrongfully detained people. For instance, at Brothers' Home, let's just say they had 3,000 people there. The government would give them enough money to feed those 3,000 people, but Brothers' Home would only buy enough food to feed 2,000 people, feed 3,000 people with it, and then pocket the rest of the cash that was supposed to feed another 1,000 people. Which meant that these people were being starved and malnourished, and then immediately then had to go work hard labor jobs building all of the buildings, including having their 14 and 15-year-old teenagers carrying all of the stones uphill. And one of the buildings that these detainees helped to build was this church on the compound, who the owner, Park In-gun, by the way, who was not ordained in any way, shape, or form, would not only give sermons at this church on a weekly basis, but in front of this massive congregation of all the thousands of detainees who were forced to be there every week, he would also shame all of the people who tried to escape and do anything wrong in front of thousands of people, telling them that he's punishing them in the name of God. And like I said, they used a lot of child labor. I mean, if you look at this photo of this shoe factory at Brothers' home, it is nothing but child workers. And if it wasn't enough that these young children were being used for hard labor, these detention centers would then court Western Adoption Agency. This is a photo at Brothers' home of such an event happening, where they literally put the children like products on display, including forcing the children to put on biblical productions for the adoption agencies. And remember, the majority of these kids actually belong to families who are now looking for them, not knowing that they've been illegally detained by the government into these detention centers. And there were a lot of children. And while kidnapped children were having ice water thrown on them by their squad leaders, and then while they were shivering without any clothes on while they were trying to fall asleep, were then getting essayed by these adults. And while parents like the father of Han Jong-sun, who's wondering what happened to his two kids who were left at the police station, and like the father of Choi Sung-woo, who was going from police station to police station filing missing child reports, all the while not knowing that the police are the ones who took his child to a detention center. And even though legally these people were only allowed to be detained at these centers for a maximum of 1 year, people like Choi Sung-woo were only released after 5 years because his father went to the brothers' home and made a protest every single day, making a scene out of the location until they finally released his two children. But unfortunately, like many of the countless people who were lucky enough to survive these detention centers, ended up taking their own lives from the trauma and from the stigma. All the while, the owner of Brothers' home, Park In-gun, who is making a fortune off the backs of these illegally detained people, are now getting 2 commendations from the president of South Korea for these, quote, amazing social programs. And Brothers' home only ended up getting shut down in 1986 because a prosecutor received an anonymous tip that a group of laborers were doing logging work with people holding bats watching over them. And even though the authorities did a thorough search of the whole compound and found so much evidence to build up the countless cases of illegal detainment as well as forced labor, the owner Park In-gun only got charged with embezzlement because they found $5 million in cash on the premises. They even dropped the illegal detainment charges, and he only ended up serving 2.5 years for embezzlement, while there were over 560 bodies that were found on this land, which was sold in 2001 for $27 million and then converted into apartment complexes. But it's being reported that the number of fatalities that happened at Brothers' home actually extends over 1,000, which means that there are essentially over 500 other bodies that are buried under these apartments now. But yeah, that's the real life Squid Game, and like I said, there's no games, just torture, death, and classism.